Hey, what's up? It's your boy Beasley, and welcome back to another episode of the Bate Escape podcast, the podcast dedicated to all things masturbation. I am so excited for y'all to listen to this episode. I have an amazing guest that I sit down and chat with, and that person is Dr. Eric Sprankle, who is a professor of clinical psychology and the co-director of the Sexuality Studies program at Minnesota State University, Mankato. He received his doctorate in clinical psychology from Xavier University in 2009, completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Minnesota Medical School's Institute for Sexual and Gender Health in 2011, and was awarded tenure in the psychology department at Minnesota State in 2017. He is the author of the recently published book DIY: The Wonderfully Weird History and Science of Masturbation, which is a topic of our conversation for this podcast. As always, I hope you find this conversation educational, informative, and fun. And thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy it. Again, thank you so much for coming on this podcast and speaking with me. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Mhm.
I feel like, okay, for the people that are listening and tuning in, I have Dr. Eric Sprankle, who recently just came out with a new book called The Wonderfully Weird History and Science of Masturbation, DIY, which is really great. So I was telling you that I've been a fan of your work for a while because I was just like, oh, this person gets it just from like a educational point of view, like all of your like social media. Like I was just like, okay, like it really resonates with me, and I feel like um super smart about the topic. But as I was reading, so the first thing that I noticed in this book was for the baiters and the haters.
Right.
You literally dedicate this book to baiters. So my first question was just like, why a book on masturbation? Why was this subject important enough for you to write about?
Yeah, I wasn't planning on doing that. And that dedication, a little tongue in cheek with it, but the haters part in the dedication was really kind of the genesis of it. It was really seeing just some nonsense online, primarily in the comment section and a lot of my social media posts about masturbation and just a lot of people just talking about masturbation's negative effects on like a physical level and a psychological level, and how masturbation causes depression and social anxiety, and you'll lose a lot of testosterone, and you won't be able to, um, you know, get into relationships, and it causes erectile dysfunction and all these things. And they were speaking with such confidence, and I was just like, where is this coming from? Because I thought, believing masturbation caused, blindness and hairy palms were just kind of things that we heard as a kid and just kind of, grew out of. But these
Hmm.
were like, strong believers in some of these physical effects of masturbation. And I had some, my gut reaction to it was like, oh, this is obviously bullshit. But I have like, enough of a intellectual and academic curiosity and somewhat of enough humility. I was like, all right, let me at least look into their claims to see where this is coming from, because I don't think they're making it up. I think that they are reading this someplace, or at least misinterpreting what they're reading. So let me see where this is coming from. And that really kind of sparked the interest in writing the book, because once I started seeing like, oh yeah, this person is certainly not alone in this belief, that there are certainly large segments of the population that share these ridiculous pseudoscientific beliefs about the effects of masturbation. And so I wanted to better understand where these beliefs are coming from, and also like, why are so many people so gullible in believing these beliefs?
Gullible. That's a good
Yeah.
word.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's one thing, because like a lot of people can see this stuff online, like masturbation causes a loss of
Yeah,
testosterone and stuff, be like, no, that's not right, and move on with their day. What's the
yeah.
difference between that person and the person who sees it and gets freaked out about masturbation, worrying now that every time they ejaculate, they're losing T and becoming like hypogonadal? Like what's the mechanism within them that they bought into that false belief?
Yeah, and then as I was reading the book, I was starting to think like I feel like a lot of people just don't have a lot of internet literacy.
Yeah, yeah,
Like they're
that's a
taking it,
huge driver.
but also too like they're taking this information and they're using it to back up their own narratives
Hmm.
of what they believe. And fundamentally, like as you go into the book, a lot of things just started coming up. It's like, is it really a fundamental belief that masturbation is bad? Is it simply just a change in perspective that people need to change? But
Hmm.
then you go into the detail, like fundamentally, like just masturbation, porn, sex has just been viewed as just wrong,
Right.
right? From the very
Right.
beginning. Can you talk about that? Like, how did how do we just evolve as humans to believe that this thing that we're doing naturally is
Hmm.
automatically bad?
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint like the exact moment in time where it's like, okay, now we're going
Sure.
to start as a society start viewing masturbation as something that's less than or wrong. Religion certainly has been a huge player in this and Western cultures, and we cannot deny that negative impact that still exists today, whether or not we are, because this exists in large groups of non-believers and atheists too. But because religion puts out such a strong, like just general anti-sex message, and
Yeah.
masturbation is included in that, because there's just like one very narrow Pope-approved sexual behavior that you can engage in, and everything else, masturbation included, is frowned upon as a sin. You're going to hell or whatever,
Yeah.
that even if you don't believe that, that exists in our culture and we get bombarded with those messages daily. And it's hard not to internalize that and feel some level of guilt, shame, embarrassment about engaging in those non-Vatican approved behaviors, masturbation being one of them. So religion obviously is a big driving force within that, but also we have these views about masculinity. And this was the surprising thing for me because I knew religion was going to be a dominant force in the book and talking about that. I devote a chapter to it, and it's also a theme kind of throughout the book.
Hmm.
But the big surprise was how much of a role like masculinity was playing as like a driver of anti-masturbation rhetoric, and how masturbation was being viewed as incompatible with idealized masculinity. And the view is that to be a manly man, a true man with a capital M with a TM next to his trademark, that you need to be directing all of your sexual energy to pursuing women. And it's very like heteronormative too,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so to be a man, you need to be a heterosexual man. You need to be chasing women, conquering women, procreating with women, and anything short of that, you're just essentially falling victim to your own passions, and you are not using your genitals in a way that you should be. And so, viewing masturbation as a way of kind of falling short of this idealized masculinity, both in terms of that it's like a weakness of character that you don't have control over your own urges, and that you're giving in to sexual desire when that desire should be motivating you to seek out partners. You're just giving it in by yourself. That's frowned upon from a gender norm perspective. And then
Yeah.
also this belief that didn't really emerge until the early 1700s, when we started viewing masturbation as harming your body physically. That's when that kind of started emerging. And that kind of emerged in Western Europe with kind of a emergence of like this big wellness campaign that came around that time as well.
Yeah.
But it's the belief that masturbation physically, quote unquote, feminizes you. And so that's where the belief started coming, that you lose testosterone, your body starts changing, you start becoming more of a woman physically. And so therefore it's not a man's role to masturbate because you essentially turn in physically to a woman.
And was that
S
tested though? Like this idea, this belief, had there
Of
been?
course not. No, no. It was coming from people who had no medical backgrounds
Right.
whatsoever. So a big proponent of it was Sylvester Graham, who was a reverend in New
Mhm.
England in the 1800s. He read a couple of medical textbooks, but he was not a physician. He was just a reverend, and his beliefs about masturbation and sex in general were just purity nonsense. And
Right.
so he was just spouting this under the guise of, oh, I know what I'm talking about from like a scientific perspective, but it was all coming from his moralistic view of sexuality. And
Yeah.
but what's interesting is even the physicians who are spouting this nonsense, because I talk about a lot of different physicians of the 1800s and the 1900s who were equally just as ridiculous as some of these pastors. It wasn't based on any scientific evidence. At best, it was based on some of their observations from some of their clinical work, but it
Oh,
was all through the lens of their purity beliefs about sex. And so a big one is like John Kellogg, who was in a psychiatric hospital in Michigan, right?
Yeah.
And the big thing with trying to make sense of like how masturbation was harmful to people was that they would see patients in a psychiatric hospital, those with, psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, openly masturbate within like public areas within the hospital. And they concluded, the physicians, that, oh, masturbation must lead to psychosis. That was the directionality of those two variables, the psychosis and the masturbation. They saw patients with psychosis masturbating. So, oh, masturbation must cause psychosis, not the other way around of like, oh, maybe the psychotic disorder is creating some judgment errors in which is causing them to
Yeah.
masturbate in inappropriate places, right? They were
Yeah.
just so freaked out by seeing masturbation that they assumed that this was causing their mental illness. And that was not, again, that was
That
just
is
an observational bias.
that's so wild.
Yeah. Mhm. And that stuck around for forever until really Kinsey started and Kinsey didn't like study masturbation in any way other than just descriptive data of just like asking people how often they did it. And so he really just had like frequencies and percentages, but at least that started, this term gets overused a lot, but like kind of somewhat normalized that masturbation is definitely well practiced in the population and is not limited to just sex offenders and those who are mentally ill, but pretty much almost everyone is doing it. So let's better understand like the mechanisms behind masturbation. And that really launched much better scientific evidence about the effects of masturbation and the motivations behind masturbation. But that's only been going on for the past 50, 60 years.
Damn. That's such a short time.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of our scientific knowledge of masturbation, we're still in our infancy in understanding it.
But that's so wild though. But like I feel like you made such great points, and I'm probably gonna go back and forth on a couple of
Hmm.
things. But one of the things that I really stuck out to me was this idea of like it, human excellence,
Hmm.
and that we're getting smarter in so many different areas of other places in our lives as human beings. Like, why can't we just add that to our sex? Like, if we're
Right.
getting smarter in other places, you would think that sex would be on the list of advancements too. And you
Right.
make a case for that, like all of these like new toys and vibrators and these apps and um like just general advancements. Do you think that'll be continued, or do you think that sex and porn and masturbation will always be argued about?
Yeah, I'm pretty cynical about it. I'm not the best person in terms of like I could never be a motivational speaker, write little bits of inspiration. That's not me. That's not my style. So just know that this is just my beliefs, and it's
Yeah,
it's it's certainly coming from a place of darkness. And that is no, I think at least in the near future of the next 50, 100 years or so, this will always be a point of contention. I think
yeah,
there will always be tech advances, and with new tech advances, it will always be sexualized. The great term that I use in the book from a historian, Dr. Kate Lister, says she coined the term kink blink, and that's the amount of time it takes, the very short amount of time it takes between something when it gets invented and when that thing becomes sexualized. And it's very, very short, right? So like the vibrator wasn't invented for sexual purposes. It was for like other types of like muscular kind of healing. But when the vibrator was first invented and when it was starting to be used on the genitals for sexual purposes, very short amount of time, like a kink blink, right? Very short.
yeah,
So, and same thing like with the internet, and it's a driver, and a lot of times sexual motivations are the driver in tech that we saw with like determining what formatting are we going to have with like home movies and discs, right? And like porn drives that, and like payment
yeah.
processing. And, so I think all that new technology is going to be wrapped up in porn and masturbation. But will that eliminate the shame and the embarrassment and the guilt and the pushback and the reactionary politics and all the rules and regulations and policies that are trying to restrict it? I don't think so. It'll always be a push and pull.
Could this also just be a matter of capitalism? Like we're trying to invent these things because we just want to make money off of it, and like sex sells, so like that would
Hmm.
be like the perfect industry to create these things. So like I would think that technology would just solely advance simply because we can charge you more. Like people are, buying these VR headsets that are like $3,500
Right.
to like get more realistic point of porn. Like I'm just trying to
Hmm.
like understand like the end game.
Yeah, I mean, with the capitalism thing, what's interesting because I would, there is, obviously sex sells and everything, but you think it would sell more if there were fewer regulations on it than there are today.
Yes.
Some of the ridiculous stuff that's coming out every day now with the age verification laws and like Sesta Fosta
Hmm.
and everything that just is really trying to just shut down industries as a whole. And obviously under the guise of like protect the children, and we know better than that. It's just trying to shut down an entire industry. It's not really about the kids.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is kind of like if it is really truly profit driven, our kind of like Puritan attitudes about sex are still trying to like get in the way of profit, even from
Hmm.
like the different ways that we can profit off of masturbation and sexual content. So I don't know. Like I'm bleak with this. Like it's disheartening. I can't even keep up with every day. And I know there are a couple of reporters. I'm drawing a blank on their names. Gustavo Turner is
Hmm.
one who writes about this, and it's just depressing every day to see like a new state introducing legislation that aims to restrict pornography in some way or sex work in some way. And this is we can focus on or think about it in a way, and I think the general public thinks of it in this way too, like, oh, porn is just this separate thing, like it's a medium, and yeah, that's true, but porn is for masturbating, and
Yeah.
it's more than that, but that's how people engage with it. And so
Hmm.
I view like any attack and restriction on pornography is also an attack on our autonomy as in our solo sexuality to express ourselves through masturbation, through
Yeah.
visual media.
Yeah.
And so that piece gets missed and overlooked in the porn battles too, because it's easy just kind of like scapegoat porn. Oh, that's nasty, that's smut, that's harmful to society. It's like, well, that's being used to masturbate. Let's actually have the conversation about solo sexuality and the role of masturbation in people's lives and in society, and then we'll start seeing how ridiculous it is that we're trying to regulate that.
God, so many things. Okay, so many questions. So I know you mentioned the term soul sexuality, and I don't think I actually read that word in the
Right.
entire book. Was that
No.
was that intentional?
Um, I had that included. It was in an early draft, I think in chapter 8 when I started talking about the jack off clubs.
Yeah.
And yeah, chapter 8 in particular, because I started off that chapter talking about the peep shows in Times Square in the 70s and 80s, and then going into cam work with the 21st century. And then yeah, I started talking about the jerk off clubs. That chapter, I think more than most, had the most cutting to it. Just because I've done a lot of like academic research on some of these
Hmm.
topics, and it started to get really academic and started taking on a different tone than the rest
Yeah.
of the book, which is for a general audience. And this isn't an academic book. It's certainly supported by a lot of empirical research. It's all cited in the book, but
Yeah.
it's for an average reader. Yeah, so it's just so much got cut. And I did have, it was a section on solo sexuality as kind of like a sexual orientation. And one of the things that my editor kept putting in the margins in earlier drafts, and it was like her term, was just like, this is getting a little too far out in the weeds. And that was just her
Gotcha.
expression of like, it's getting a little too far from the main kind of focus, tone, style of the book. And
Okay.
so, yeah, so that was cut from the final draft, and it didn't make the book. But yeah, that was in there, and it was part of my conceptualization of it. And I in hindsight, I viewed it, at least when I was first writing it, as an important piece. But yeah, I can see how it was drifting a little bit further from some of the points I was getting across in it.
Right
Because
on.
the original goal was not to mention like sexual orientation at all, because or gender, because my focus was going to be, okay, I'm talking about a behavior, and I'm going to
Yeah.
be talking about body parts, and so I don't need
Hmm.
to gender this at all. But I quickly learned like that wasn't going to be possible because of so much of the restrictions on masturbation were very, very gendered. Like I was talking about earlier, how much of it was about masculinity.
Yeah.
And then just a lot of the research was very gendered. That I had to get into it a little bit. And I talked a little bit about sexual orientation with some of the subcultures that like some of the jack off clubs, I talk about sexual orientation that's not exclusively for gay and bi men,
Yeah.
that there are some straight guys, and how does that factor into it? But largely, I try to avoid it because it kind of, masturbation kind of transcends sexual orientation. It is just a behavior, regardless of like who you're attracted to or what you're thinking about. It is just like a sexual act.
Yeah, that was one of the parts that I appreciated the most because I feel like being in the community, being in this space, I do come across a lot of men that are conflicted and they can't really they're conflicted with the idea of like looking at penis, enjoying masturbating with other men,
Hmm.
but then conflicted with their own sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And I feel like
Hmm.
you do that in multiple parts in the book where you're just like, it's cool. Like
Yeah. Right.
you don't have to stress out about so much. It can just simply be the fact that you enjoy your penis and that you
Right.
love to masturbate with a bunch of men. It doesn't have to go any deeper than that. It's not
Right.
so deep. And I think
Hmm.
you did a really good job with the overall tone of the book because it's fucking funny.
No,
Like
thanks. That was the
people
top goal. I just wanted to be funny. Right.
and I was just like people who do read the book, and you should read the book,
Thank you.
should really pay attention to like the footnotes. Like
Oh yeah.
that's where all the punchlines are,
Yeah.
which is really great. But another thing too, I forgot which part of the book it was, but I think like just as myself as people like also too being in the community, I come across a lot of anxious people, a lot
Hmm.
of people who are just like worried that they're doing something evil to themselves. And again,
Sure.
we've talked about religion and shame and all those things, but I think hearing it from like a clinical professional educated
Hmm.
perspective to say, bro, like there's nothing wrong with you masturbating, you're
Right.
simply going to be okay. I appreciate it just having it written down, and I don't think a
Hmm.
lot of people are getting that information from like a verified source.
Hmm.
um what was like the reasoning behind wanting to just be like you're going to be okay rather than being a purely academic book? But I feel like there was intentional behind it. Like you wanted baiters, overall masturbators, to just be kind of like you're taking care of us. Like you're gonna be fine. This is totally good.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted when I wrote this, the primary goal was just to write like a funny, entertaining book. That was always like the top goal.
Hmm.
I then to make it obviously informative and counter a lot of the myths that I was coming across. And like I was talking about, that was actually the genesis of the book, to come in, seeing a lot of the pseudoscience that was out there and the misinformation. I didn't want to write just a traditional kind of self-help book where I was kind of working through people's shame and like the worksheet kind of style. Um, and here are like 10 steps to overcome some masturbation guilt. That's not my style,
Hmm.
but I wanted to do that kind of indirectly through education and through repetition, of like some of these topics of like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you for thinking certain fantasies. There's nothing wrong with you for wanting to masturbate and masturbating 3, 4, or 5 times a day. There's nothing wrong with you for, using these sex toys, for stimulating your prostate, for, watching this kind of pornography. You're fine. You're going to be just fine. I talk about, times in which, people do get themselves into some trouble with masturbation when it does become a clinical issue. And what's ironic with that is that it's generally a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you think masturbation is
Yes.
harmful to you and you do it, then you're going to feel pretty shitty about yourself. And that's when it becomes a problem. That's when it becomes a therapeutic issue.
That's
And
so funny.
it's,
That is exactly what I wrote. Page
yeah,
94 is self-fulfilling prophecy. Baiting is good, therefore I am good.
right. Yeah.
Like that's what I was thinking. Like focus on the bad, and that's all you're going to see. But if you focus on the good,
Hmm.
so like, so then I started Googling. So I actually literally asked Siri. I was like, "What's the difference between belief and perspective?"
Hmm.
Because I'm just like, does one need to fundamentally change in
Hmm.
order to change the perspective on masturbation, or it's just like, do you need to really work on the belief that this is inherently harmful to you?
Yeah, that's the hard thing because I can. I can have like this authoritative voice in this book as, the credible expert, so to speak, writing this as a clinical psychologist, 20 years experience, as a sexual health specialist,
Mhm.
saying that, yeah, masturbation is not harmful to your body. You're not going to get, it's not a causal element in depression, social anxiety. You're not going to lose testosterone, all these things that you see online. It's not going to damage your brain, all these things. It's just not true. I
Mhm.
can say that, and for some people that'll be enough, just correcting misinformation. Like, okay, yeah, what I saw on Reddit, scared me a little bit because it seemed, they had citations there, but I can see now how that was wrong. That was misinformation. They were kind of misinterpreting research. Reading, my book, kind of set the record straight. And sometimes education is all you needed, and that was kind of a motivator, and kind of a goal with the book is just self-help through education. But
Mhm.
for others, it certainly won't be enough that they have like very core beliefs that masturbation is wrong.
Yeah.
And those core beliefs can stem from a lot of things. It can be just like what we were talking about earlier, one of those two things of like their religious beliefs that they've heard for so long in their life that masturbation is unhealthy and it's a sin and it's wrong, morally wrong. And even if they didn't get the direct message that like from a priest or a pastor that don't masturbate or you go to hell, they got enough messages about sexual purity that they put the pieces together themselves that masturbation is not a good thing within their religion.
Got it.
And that's the thing. Like we oftentimes we don't get direct, explicit messages that masturbation is a sin and you're going to go to hell if you do it. We get kind of fragmented pieces of information, some of it correct, some of it incorrect, a lot of gaps. And then we just kind of fill those gaps with old wives' tales, misinformation, fear mongering, moral panics. And we're just kind of left with a lot of anxiety about, I don't
Mhm.
think this is really good for me, but I can't really articulate why. So we're just kind of left with some angst about
It
it, right?
That's so weird. Yeah, it is. Yes, but it's so weird to me. Like, how can something so good be so bad for you?
I know, right? Yeah, and something that we've been doing our whole life in one way or another, right? I start off the book with from a developmental perspective of like this is with us from the get-go. It looks a lot different when we're younger, and it's motivated
Yeah.
differently than when we're a little bit older in childhood and adolescence and adulthood. But it's there,
Yeah.
as a soothing mechanism for ourselves. And you would think, yeah, something that is so pleasurable and so reinforcing and has a function in our life from so early on to satisfy us in so many
Yeah.
different ways, yet it is like so like tainted with like these societal beliefs that we get from a variety of different perspectives that just kind of ruin that experience, right?
Yeah.
We don't have to teach our bodies to feel good about touching ourselves, but we do have to learn how to feel ashamed about that. And that's the unfortunate part.
I know.
And unlearning that shame is, like I was saying, like sometimes that can be an easy process of just some increase in knowledge and information, but other times it's so deeply rooted that, yeah,
Yeah.
one book isn't going to be enough, that we really need to, explore where these beliefs are coming from. Are these beliefs still valuable for the person, or are they just leftovers from what our parents gave us? So that's the big thing, especially like with
That's
religious beliefs,
that's
right?
so
Is
fucking real. Hell yeah,
yeah,
dude.
yeah,
Because
is
I
like,
feel like I struggle. I have definitely been in that boat for sure.
mm-hmm,
And it has taken a really long time to learn that shame and to begin to understand and just feel empowered through masturbation.
yeah,
And I think, I don't know, maybe it is the beliefs, like just fundamental your beliefs you really have to put into question
mm-hmm.
if that's something that you really want to explore.
Well, the thing is
The,
like, yeah, it's like if the research is conclusive about anything, and I would say that it's not, and that's the big thing. But the closest that we can get to some like consistency in research with masturbation is this idea of moral incongruence, is that if we have values that don't align with our behaviors, that's going to cause some problems for us. So that's what I was saying earlier, that if we have a belief that says that masturbation is wrong, it's unhealthy, it's immoral or in some way, but we do it anyways, we're going to feel distress about that. We're going to feel out of control when we do it, even label ourselves as an addict because we're doing something that we told ourselves we shouldn't be doing at all.
Yeah.
It can cause a whole host of problems. Now, doing that then and having that experience, that person, if they have the insight and understanding like where this is coming from, ultimately it's their choice whether or not they want to change that. So a lot of times these guys will come into therapy and just want to change their behavior, right? They want to abstain from masturbation. And
Yeah.
therefore abstinence is therefore aligning with their values because their values say don't do this. And so therefore they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that can work. Maybe that can be a torturous life, right? Because if their authentic self has this drive and they want to masturbate, and that's an important part of expressing their sexuality, abstaining from that is, yeah, it's going to be pretty miserable. And, abstinence probably isn't going to be a perfect track record, and you're going to be, have slips. And that's going to create a whole host of, distress and problems in your life, but they
Yeah.
have to recognize like that's their cross to bear that they're choosing in their life. They don't have
Mm.
to choose that.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing that often gets overlooked because in psychology, at least in our profession, we're so cautious not to, influence someone's own value system. And I recognize the
I
good in
see.
that, right? Because we don't, as like clinicians, don't want to impose our own value system on our patients, right?
Sure, sure.
But I don't, but I think we get too cautious with that sometimes, and where we don't like explore their value system at all. We just take it at face value as like, okay, this is what it is. Let's just focus on the behaviors that don't align with that values. I think that does the patients a great disservice that we need to examine like, where
Hmm.
do these values come from? Was this given to you from your parents? Did you pick this up later on in life? Do they still have value for you now? Do they still serve a function in your life? Is this important for you? Or are they just leftovers that they don't really matter? You're just kind of going through the motions, or you feel compelled to hang on to them because you don't want to disappoint
Hmm.
your parents, something like that. Those can be worked with. And then there's some wiggle room there with the values that maybe they can ease off a bit, and you don't have to change the behaviors a little bit as much, and the values actually change, and then you
Yeah.
can have alignment and you can still incorporate masturbation into your life without the distress.
That was the other interesting point that you made in the book, that it's like we're so quick to assume that the masturbation is bad, that we're not
Hmm.
actually looking at the other factors that could be bad. Like, okay, why aren't we questioning religion? Why
Right.
aren't we questioning education? Like, why do we automatically assume that the sex is the part that's difficult
You're
or
right.
troublesome,
Hmm.
which I found really interesting.
Yeah, because we don't do that with other behaviors. I gave
We
a couple of
don't.
examples of like, a couple, because oftentimes, and I don't do clinical work now, but when I did clinical work, it was very common for a couple to come in after, and it was very gendered. It was like, a man and a woman. Guy got caught with, watching porn or something that violated, some aspect of their relationship contract, whether that was spoken, oftentimes it was unspoken.
Mhm.
And he labeled himself a sex addict, and he wanted treatment to like never look at porn again, never masturbate again. And I understand that it created conflict because he had like this secret life. And the therapy was actually recognizing that the secrecy was actually the harmful part of the
That's right.
relationship. And there
Yeah.
was a legit like betrayal there. And like, I didn't want to minimize the impact of like that secrecy and the harm that caused in the relationship. But it actually had nothing to do with like porn and jerking off. It was the secrecy. Because I didn't really do this in therapy, but I made the point in the book of like, what if the couple had a problem with the guy going out every weekend and just playing golf and spending so
Yes.
much money on golf and spending all of his time? And that's an opportunity cost and a financial cost, and all these things that could be directed at the relationship. And that can certainly create a lot of problems for couples because it's a distancing behavior that guy is engaging in by just going out and friends and neglecting things at home and just leaving everything, for his wife to do. And if they're raising kids together, it's all on her. He's spending money on himself, all this. If they entered therapy, it would never be with the goal of you're never to play golf again. That would never be it. It would be like some type of compromise of like, how can golf be incorporated into this relationship in a healthier way?
Mhm.
But how we talk about porn and masturbation is never in that way, typically, right? Especially
Yeah.
from like a sex addiction kind of model. It's always like, no, this is the bad thing that's hurting your relationship. How do we cut this cancer out?
Yeah.
But a healthier version of approaching this in therapy is like, okay, this has caused problems in your relationship. How can this exist in a healthier way?
God, that seems like the more logical
It does,
way
yeah,
of like
right,
thinking about it, but it's just
right,
surprising a lot of people don't see it that way.
right.
Also, too, what comes to mind is this idea of like using masturbation as a waste of time.
Hmm.
Well, I can view going to playing golf for hours as a waste of time,
Right.
but also too, like you're not asking the right questions. Like, what is it that you're actually learning from, or like how are you finding these things empowering?
Hmm.
Also, too, like I think like they don't come from that perspective. Like when
Hmm.
I masturbate and I'm watching porn and I'm in my own solitary pleasure, you have no idea what I'm thinking about or like what I'm watching or the questions that I'm asking of myself, right? Like,
Hmm.
and I feel like it's really important to say that great change can come from enjoying masturbation in your own private time. And I feel like I've
Sure.
been so empowered in my life just having that quiet time by myself. Like,
Yeah.
there's no, there's no room for other voices to come into play. I'm not, looking at social media or trying to dictate what this all kind of means to me. All I'm
Hmm.
really proving to myself is like, hey, I'm reinforcing my own appearance, or I'm reinforcing the fact that I'm watching average bodies, or and you go
Hmm.
into that too. Like, why aren't we looking? I think it's the chapter on porn illiteracy,
Hmm.
where it's just like, why aren't we really looking at porn from like a empowering place? Like,
Hmm.
what is it that we're really looking at? We're just looking at the bad, but porn can offer so many good things to so many different people, and I know that because I get that feedback.
Right.
Like people start to watch themselves, like their own bodies or their own ethnicities or their own ages, and I think that's empowering. Again, it goes back to
Hmm.
like, if you think it's good, it's going to be good. But
Right.
porn is good,
Right.
or at
It
least I think
certainly
so.
it can be. Yeah. And yeah, it's just an attitude if and I got to the end of the book too, and it was just kind of like it's just a moment of pleasure, right? Whether you're
Yeah,
using porn or not, it's just the masturbating. It's just a moment of pleasure. It doesn't have to be anything more than that. But I like the point that you were just making that it is a moment to yourself, right? And that it's not then yeah, this is a criticism of it, especially from like the masculine wellness kind of thing of like, oh, you should be like hitting the gym or something, that it's an opportunity cost of doing something better or more productive with your time. Kind of that nonsense is like,
yeah,
no, it is a good use of your time, like anything. Like you can justify
yeah.
anything that you who are we to like why do we have to get approval of like our every moment of our day? You know, um, what's interesting is
Oh,
that I really love horror movies, and this is how it plays out. Masturbation plays out in horror movies so well, at least in one capacity. Is that and it plays out in a horrific way so well. In a couple of movies. One is The Babadook, and the other is Black Swan. Black Swan's a little bit more popular. It's that Natalie Portman movie where she was a ballerina dancer.
yeah,
There's a movie there or a part there. If you're not familiar with the film, she's like, as we would expect with a lot of ballerinas, like very, very rigid, overly controlled, perfectionistic, wants this role as the Black Swan so bad, hyper competitive, dance company, so much pressure from her peers, from her dance instructors, choreographers, definitely from her mom. Her whole life is just structured down to the second. And then there's
mhm,
a scene where she's waking up in her bedroom in the morning and she like rolls over onto her stomach and she starts to masturbate, completely out of character from what we have seen from her from so far, because it's just like this moment to herself where she's just kind of letting go and like having some pleasure, and it's like unscripted, and I'm sure she didn't have that in her to-do list for that day, and
right,
she's just enjoying herself, and it's like, wow, this is like a moment just for her. And then she like opens her eyes and she sees her mom's like is sleeping in a chair in the corner of her bedroom, and just like startles her, and she gets back to like even that moment of just autonomy is crushed, and that's what makes it like a horror movie, and how like even that moment of but how masturbation is supposed to be this just moment to ourselves, this reflection and expression of autonomy, and then put that in a horror movie and how that autonomy can be crushed and how crushing and horrifying that can actually be.
That is really terrifying.
Yeah, when it's taken away from us like that. Yeah. Yeah, no one wants to wake up and see a parent like sleeping in the room when we think we're alone masturbating.
Well, even if you're not masturbating, I don't want to wake up
Right.
and
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
like
That's
my mom in the
startling.
corner just be like, what is even
Right.
happening here? Did they even give me
Right.
permission to do that? Um, oh my God, I have like so many notes.
Yeah.
Um, oh, I love on page 19 that you're like, I wrote here, therapists are into edging.
Therapists are into edging.
Yeah, well, like you give a case of like people who might have troubles with like erectile dysfunction or premature ejaculation. And so
Oh
you
yeah,
go
the
into
stop start stuff. Yeah.
yeah, you go into the whole stop stuff and
Hmm.
then as I was reading that, I was like, is this just like edging? And then a couple of pages later, it's like edging. But I also wanted to point out too on page 120 when you introduced the word goon, which
Yeah.
I appreciate.
Yeah.
Um, what's your take on gooning?
That was actually a new one for me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, much like the jack off clothes. I saw that you interviewed Paul Rosenberg recently.
Yeah, yeah. And when you
Um,
mentioned him in the book, I was like, oh,
mhm.
that's so cool.
Yeah, yeah. He's interviewed me a couple of times for his podcast, and that was my
Nice.
introduction to jack off clubs. And I was just like blown away. I was like, wow, these things exist. And so that was like an eye-opening experience for me getting to learn about that a couple of years ago. And so I certainly wanted to talk about that in the book. And then with the researching of the book, I came across, the subcultures of like gooning and the practice of that. And
Hmm.
obviously, there's not much written about it other than just some anecdotes and some things that are written for like, some
Yeah.
clickbaity kind of articles that are out there. And yeah, it's just one of those things that I wanted to touch upon that is kind of an extreme edge of edging. And it's yeah, I think I wrote something recently. Oh yeah, for Men's Health. It was like a Q&A when I was doing the original book promotion for it the week that it came out. I wrote something. Somebody had a question about gooning that I responded to in Men's Health. And yeah, it's one of those things. If you like it, great. If not, whatever. It's
Yeah.
like it's like anything else. It's like I don't care what you're doing with your penis.
Yeah,
Enjoy it.
definitely.
Um,
I think it's great. I appreciate you mentioning it because I do feel like it's such a celebrated characteristic within
hmm
the masturbator community, and I think it's like a beautiful part of like our culture.
hmm
And I was interviewing a baiter in the community last week for my podcast, and he quoted as being said like gooners are the court jesters of sex. And I was like,
hmm
oh, that's so true. Because I just feel like even and it does like go back to the reference of your book where you just make really it's a fun read and it doesn't have to be so serious. And I
Right.
think as masturbators and as gooners in this community, I think we do offer that. And I think that's such a beautiful space to be that we can
hmm
show people who are curious, who do have a lot of shame, who are really anxious about masturbation, like it doesn't have to be so serious. Like
You're right.
it's fun. Like
Right.
just enjoy it, have a blast, and watch people have a blast too. And like
hmm
in people who aren't familiar for gooning, it's like intense pleasure to the point where you're just like prolonged edging. And so
hmm
it manifests physically. So that's why you have like the silly faces and the
hmm
cross eyes and the tongues are out. And I do think it's like it's true. It's like a up to date court jester. It's like the modern court jester.
Yeah.
People with like their iPhones looking at porno and just making crazy faces. What's something else that I really want to talk to you about that? Oh, on page 64. So jerking and empathy. Generally, is it harder for men to empathize? I think the idea came was um from having spaces together, and I think that was another reason why men have trouble or have difficulties coming with the terms with the fact that they do like to see other men
mm
masturbating with each
hmm
other, and it's like this idea of empathizing, like I know what you're feeling and I want to feel
Oh,
it too
right.
or feel it with you. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about empathizing for masturbate or
Yeah.
masturbation and empathy?
That was something that I just came up with.
Hmm.
Kind of exploring my experience with it because there's some things written about straight guys who go to jack off clubs and like kind of questioning their sexuality, or like outsiders questioning their sexuality on their behalf, of like, what do you, come on, like a straight
Yeah.
guy,
Yeah.
hanging out with a bunch of guys
Like
jerking
it's
off,
so
like,
hard to
come on.
believe.
Right. And so then I get into, kind of explaining that, of like what it's actually about. And it's like, and it's a lot of nuance with sexual orientation that kind of goes above a lot of people's heads, of like, yeah, it was like, when you, what is actually sexual attraction to somebody? Is it just the genitals? Is it the secondary sexual characteristics? Is it the person as a whole? Can you just fetishize, be a partialist and just fetishize the penis? Is it just the act of masturbation, and that's actually what is attractive, and it doesn't actually matter who it's attached to? All these
Yeah.
things, right? Sexual orientation, very, very complex. But even beyond all of that, um, looking at it from the perspective that I noticed, like for my own sexual orientation, and this sounds very pretentious, that I'm not really big into identity. I don't really care about like labels for myself or whatever.
Hmm.
um Identify like as straight. That's like the most convenient and like big box kind of stuff, but I often joke like there are people straighter than me, if we want to put it on like a spectrum. um but not, like bisexual or pansexual doesn't really fit, I don't think, too well. But anyways, none of that really matters to me. But what I've noticed, what I've just been curious about, is like if I'm watching videos, um that I'm primarily attracted to women,
Hmm.
but with solo masturbation videos, I find that I'm more attracted to males masturbation videos solo than women. And I was like,
Oh,
well, what is this about?
yeah.
And like my intellectual curiosity, like really kind of shot up with that. But like, okay, what's going on in here? And the best that I can like figure out is like an empathic kind of response. It'd be like, I know more of like what's going on watching a guy jerk off than a woman jerk
Gotcha.
off. It's like, yeah,
Gotcha.
I know what that feels like more than like what that feels like. I know what that position is like more than what that is. I can I've watched myself jerk off in a mirror, so I can. It's like a mirroring
Yes.
kind of behavior, and that's what's arousing about it, more so than watching a woman use a vibrator on herself, which is still erotic and everything. But it's a little bit of a different experience than a solo sexual kind of response that I see when I see a man jerking off. And so that was a very interesting kind of insight that I had. And it really wasn't about sexual orientation for me. It was more about, oh, I know what that's like. And that's erotic. That's bringing up memories of what it feels like to masturbate for myself. And that person is kind of acting out what I do to myself. And, it can even idealize it if they have like, physical characteristics that I would envy or I'm jealous of, that I wish I had in myself, whether that's primary characteristics, secondary characteristics. Be like, oh, I
Yeah.
wish I looked like that when I was masturbating. And then it just kind of, yeah, it's more about empathy, maybe a little bit of narcissism, um, more
Hell
so
yeah.
than sexual orientation. But it was just interesting. And I could see that, like, I've never been to a jack off club myself, but I could see that as being a motivator for, straighter guys to be in those kind of circles of like, yeah, we're all doing something that I know that feels really good, and we're having a great time. And it's like a
Yeah.
collective enjoyment. And it really doesn't have to be anything about, oh, I find you sexually attractive, let's make out. It's just like we're having a great time with our penises, and this feels good.
I like that term, collective enjoyment.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's so true though. And but I appreciate you saying that. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that again, it comes from having a lot of communication with men identify as straight
Mm-hmm.
and questioning their sexual orientation. And I'm always trying to make the case. And I can't. I'm not a doctor. I said it from the very beginning. Everything that I've ever talked about masturbation has come from a lived experience.
Sure.
And so for you to say it, I think holds a little bit more, a lot more power. So
But
I
that's
do
that's what
appreciate
sexual
it.
orientation is. It's lived experience. Like my perspective on
Totally.
it is more for myself, of just like I
But
don't
it
give a shit about identity for
but
me,
also
but I know other people really care about that and want to like really figure out like where they fit in it. I just
totally. But
view it more from a functional behavioral perspective of like, who do I hook up with? What kind of relationships do I have? And like
yeah.
some society has some labels for that, but I don't really
But
care.
I also want to make the case too, like I identify as a gay man, and
Hmm.
so I still have the same feelings you do.
Hmm.
Like it goes beyond sexual orientation because when
Yeah.
I do see solo masturbation porn, I'm just like I can feel that, I can
Yeah.
honor that, I understand that, and also too like just generalization as men, we're just like really proud of our dicks. So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
like, so we're just
Yeah.
like, why wouldn't we want to flaunt them to each other? So one of the things that I really found really interesting and I really enjoyed was like the arc of your book from
Mm.
like birth,
Hmm.
rebirth to death. And I
Right.
think the till death do it part was one of the more fascinating parts because
Mm.
it really brought into my own like I started thinking about my own like ageism and like
Hmm.
you go into different you write about like people like older humans in like homes, right,
Yeah.
assisted living
Yeah.
homes
Yeah.
and like
Hmm.
how can you possibly see, and then you brought in you reference Betty Dodson a lot,
Hmm.
which I really
Hmm.
appreciate.
Yeah.
But this idea that how old is too old to be a sexual viable human,
Hmm.
and that we continue to masturbate well into our old age. And then I started thinking, I was like, God, I'm such a masturbator. Like, how am I gonna do this to myself when I'm that age? When I possibly, God help me if I live to be that age, but like I want my assisted living to provide those resources to me
Hmm.
also
Yeah.
too. Like I want to be able to just ring a bell and be like, I need lube,
Right.
for my masturbation habits. Why was it important to include that aspect of like the book, like this final, and then also too, it's very endearing. Some of the things
Hmm.
that you say, like people making sex toys that can actually include ashes of your
Mm.
deceased loved ones, and like
Right.
going into that. Why was that important to capture that in the book?
Two reasons. Like you said, it was really kind of the only story arc that I had. There's not much narrative. You can just like pick it up in any chapter, any section in a chapter and read it from there. But I
Yeah.
did intentionally want to start with like fetal development and masturbation that can happen in utero as chapter one. And then chapter nine, the last chapter before the conclusion, is on older adulthood and masturbation up until like through hospice and even like, death.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I just wanted to kind of have that developmental kind of lifespan arch. So that was just kind of a structural reason to include it. But also, I do teach a class on psychology of aging, and aging for that class is just focused on older adults, so 65 and up, because there are other developmental classes that are taught by others on like adolescence and childhood development. And so in that class, I teach on older adult sexuality. I teach on death and dying, and I never combined them before. So those are separate like learning modules in that class. And so it was a challenge for me to like, how can I combine these two things? And so that was fun to kind of look into the research, and there was actually more research on it than I anticipated, especially on how sexuality, in particular masturbation, was viewed in some of these long-term care facilities and some of
Mhm.
the staff attitudes that they had about older adults, like masturbating as residents in some of these care homes. And but one thing that I always do bring into class, because I'm working with 18 to 22-year-olds mostly in these classes, is, and they have a hard time thinking about their own deaths and thinking about what life is going
Yeah.
to be like when they're in their 70s and 80s. But I have them try to envision like, okay, what's your sexuality now, your sexual expression, your ideal sexual frequency, the type of behaviors that you engage in, what do you get out of your sex life, and when do you want to give that up voluntarily?
Mm.
And they never think about it that way of like, because we think about older adults as kind of being like behaviorally asexual. Like at some
Yeah.
point, it's just not important for them anymore that they don't have sex, or their genitals no longer function in a way that allows them to have some types of sex, things like that. But is that ideal? And we just kind of accept it that like, oh, old people don't have sex, whatever, and write it off. That's part of like natural aging. So to ask that question kind of in a different way of like, so when do you no longer want to be a sexual person? That really kind of puts the onus on that younger individual to be like, well, I don't want to like voluntarily give this up. So how can I work on keeping it as part of an important part of my life until I die? And that may require, and then we get into like, yeah, age related changes to our sexuality. It requires adaptation. Our bodies do slow down. We do notice some changes to sexual functioning that have to, rely on some adjustments, maybe some sexual aids, things like that. And then getting into, long-term care facilities where maybe our mobility is more restricted, our privacy is less, and what adjustments need to be made in those environments. And so it's always just about adapting to new situations, whether it's environmental or biological with aging changes within ourselves. But it's never losing sight of valuing sexuality for ourselves, and especially
Mm-hmm.
solo sexuality, because regardless of whether we're partnered, our partner dies, or whatever, we always have our solo sexuality. And how can we continue to prioritize that? And that's on us to be able to still prioritize it and not engage in kind of like internalized ageism and just think that, oh, I'm 70. I shouldn't be bothering myself with like masturbating anymore.
Yeah.
That's a young man's game or whatever. It's like, no, 70-year-olds certainly masturbate. There's no reason why you can't or shouldn't. And so it may look
Yeah.
different than when you were 20, but how can you make this work now as a 70-year-old?
Ooh, that's a good call out. Like it's gonna look different. Like
Yeah.
you can still do it, but it's not gonna be the same. But it doesn't mean
Yeah.
that it's gonna be bad.
Yeah. It looks
Yeah.
different at 42 than it did when I was 16. So like
Hell yeah, it does.
things change. Things change. It's not like it's worse, it's just different.
Yeah, it's totally different
Yeah,
for
our
sure.
bodies are always changing, our circumstances, our environments are always changing. So how do we
Arguably
adapt
even
to that?
arguably even better, like I
Yeah,
feel.
we
Like
learn
it's
more about ourselves,
yeah,
and yeah.
definitely. But I think ultimately DIY, when I got to the end of the book, the conclusion, it just really tied everything together, the title of the book, as to
Hmm.
say, really, just to give us full autonomy of your body.
Hmm.
Like you're not as masturbators, as a masturbation practice. Find it really empowering. You're not waiting on someone else to provide the sex.
Hmm.
And one of the things that really stuck out to when I was talking with Paul was, as a masturbator, I bring my orgasm to you. I
Hmm.
bring my sex to you. I bring my pleasure to you. You don't give me those things.
Right. Hmm.
Um, is that is that something, is that correct? Did I read that right from the book?
Yeah, yeah. I talk about different interpretations of Betty Dotson's book, Liberating Masturbation. And
Which it's my next book to read for sure.
yeah, yeah, and she updated it in the '90s. I think it's called "Sex for One," but it's based on like a shorter like pamphlet that she wrote in the '70s called "Liberating Masturbation." And like the spirit of the '70s, like with the sexual revolution at that time, was really kind of like masturbation is political, and it
Mm,
can liberating masturbation also means women's liberation and gender liberation and sexual orientation liberation and like liberation for all, and it became part of like a political civil rights movement, right?
yeah, yeah.
I dampened that a little bit in the conclusion, because I kind of started equating it like, because some sex educators really prop up masturbation as kind of like, in the same way as anti-masturbation crusaders really try to take masturbation down, some sex educators really try to prop it up with some hyperbole, with some of the claims of like it'll do X, Y, and Z for you. And it's like, maybe some results may vary. The research doesn't really support it like that much for that. It's more
Right.
correlational than causal. And it's just like, okay, let's kind of soften the language around it, because otherwise we're being just as guilty as is perpetuating misinformation as some of the anti-masturbation people. And so that
Gotcha.
stuff kind of irks me a little bit. So I wanted to kind of tone down the rhetoric a little bit about like these bombastic kind of claims around masturbation benefits, and really just kind of say that it's just a moment of pleasure, but really interpret liberating masturbation less so than it's this big political act, and more of just like we are liberating sexual pleasure from dependency on anything else other than ourselves, and really recognizing that pleasure is literally at our fingertips, and how liberating that is. No one can take that from us. People can try with public policies of like, porn and sex toys and all of that outside stuff that can be regulated. But kind of analog masturbation, just with our hands, no one can touch that. That's us. That's ours. That's our autonomy. That's very liberating when we can start viewing masturbation as on par with partnered sex and as valuable as partnered sex. Partnered sex can provide a lot of things that masturbation can't, but masturbation can provide a lot of things that partnered sex can. And
Yep.
masturbation can provide a lot of things that partnered sex can't, right? So there's pros and cons to both. And I would view like one's not better than the other. They're just different. And if we
Mhm.
start viewing masturbation on like in this equal playing field as partnered sex, then we can start really seeing the power and benefit of solo sexuality and really liberating masturbation from and liberating sex more in general from its dependency on others and recognizing the power that we have in ourselves.
Damn, that's good. I feel like that's such a great way to end this
All right.
conversation. I want to thank you so much for talking to me on this podcast. I was excited to speak to you.
Yeah.
I love your book. I think it's
Thank you.
amazing. If you're a baiter, if you're not a baiter, I think everyone would really find this book interesting and informative. Again, it's Dr. Eric Sprankle, and his book is DIY: The Wonderfully Weird History and Science of Masturbation. Where else can people like know about you and follow you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram, Twitter at Dr. Sprankle, websites, drsprankle.com. That's really just my online footprint right now, those three places.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much again for talking to me about masturbation.
Yeah, my
I
pleasure.
appreciate it as a beater. I do appreciate this book. And yeah, and thank you so much. And I'm BC Bader, your host. Thank you for joining, and I hope you all really found this informative. I did too. There's points here that I didn't even get time to get to, but read the book for yourself and enjoy it. Enjoy the book
Enjoy.
and yourself.
Right. Enjoy yourself.
All right, thanks, y'all.
Thanks.
Hey, what's up? It's me, Beasley. Hey, I hope you really enjoy this episode of the Bate Escape podcast. I love producing these shows. I love talking to other masturbators about masturbation. And I just love talking to other people about sex in general. If you love this episode, make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, and that you're sharing. Probably the most important thing that you can do for this podcast is to share it with everyone you know, share it with that solosexual masturbator, baiter, gooner in your life. Let them know that they're not alone in their solosexuality. And again, I thank you always so much for your continued support with this podcast. Love ya.